joining me on this session are four panelists. We have Chris. Chris, how do you say your last name?
I'm not sure. Oh, Kahneman.
And Chris is VP of AdTran's Blue Socket Business Group. He's responsible for the revenue success and market-facing functions of AdTran's virtual WLAN product line, and he brings more than 20 years of experience with leading technology and networking companies. That includes Avicii Systems, Colubris Networks, I think I pronounced that right, and Redline Communications. Also on this panel is Curt Beckmann. Curt is a principal architect at Brocade. He also chairs the ONF's Forwarding Abstractions Working Group and is a member of the Chipmakers Advisory Board. He started in the industry as an ASIC architect at Bay Networks back in 1995, and these days he's focused on enhancing the open flow standard to accelerate hardware adoption of new features. And Mark Durrett, in the green tie, is also among our esteemed panelists today. He's the head of corporate communications and market strategy at Overture Networks, which offers carrier Ethernet and Ensemble OSA Metro Edge solutions. He's also the executive editor of CarrierEthernetNews.com, an active contributor to both the MEF and the Open Networking Foundation, and he holds a degree in electrical and computer engineering. And he previously worked with Hatteras Networks, Covolite Systems, NetEdge Systems, and Wandel and Golterman. And I'd also like to introduce and welcome Imran Yusuf. Did I pronounce that correctly? Great. He's VP of Business Development and Strategic Alliances at Cosmos. He has more than 15 years of experience in the industry, spanning both semiconductor and software companies. And previously, he served as Director of Global Alliances and Business Development at Wind River. He's also worked in various roles at Intel, and he holds a master's degrees in aerospace and mechanical engineering and holds 4 patents related to microprocessor cooling. As I mentioned, I'm Paula Bernier. I work for Technology Marketing Corporation that stages this event, and I run 3 of their 4 magazines, Internet Telephony being one of them. I'm the editorial lead on that. So let's get started and raise any questions as they come up. But I guess that this panel is a bit of a rewind because I feel like the last couple sessions were maybe a little deeper dives. But I think before you really need to get into conversations about new technologies and new acronyms, as we so often see in telecom and IT, you have to really define your terms and make sure everybody's speaking the same language or at least close to the same language. So I'd like to take it in 2 pieces. Let's talk about NFV first, Network Functions Virtualization. And I just wondered if we could start out by what's the basic definition of NFV?
Yeah, I'll look at this. Are our mics on?
Are they on? Check.
I think so.
We're on. So I think with network functions virtualization, I mean the basic idea is separation of the control and data plane, with that control plane being virtualized, running on a hypervisor. To me, that's the essence.
Mark, do you agree?
I guess I have a little bit different take, and it's really, to us, it's the separation of the software from the underlying hardware, really, and the move to functions that historically have been delivered on dedicated hardware appliances to much more generic appliances. And, we can get a lot more particular about the definition, but I think at the most fundamental level, that's the way I see it.
Okay. What's your view?
So can everyone hear me in the back? No? Test? No? Test? No? Is this better? Okay. All right. So at Cosmos, let's parse it this way. I think I agree with my panelists' definition and characterization of NFV. Just rewind and clock back a little bit. If you look at SDN, it's been around since 2007. So you can look at SDN in some ways giving rise to NFV. With SDN, the premise is, how we can build software on these networks. And we're looking primarily at layer 2 and layer 3, and obviously you can extend that more broadly to layer 4, 5, 6, and 7. And that's where I think NFV comes into play, where you can essentially virtualize the network. So it's kind of a, if you will, a marriage of SDN infrastructure, and you're looking at NFV, which is the architecture. So they both go together. NFV clearly is an initiative that's being driven primarily by carriers, and it's compared to SDN, it's relatively new.
Curt, what's your view on NFV?
Yeah, I like that take, Yusuf. I certainly think SDN's been around a bit longer than NFV. And in conversation with Christos, who was in the last panel, he described how he was involved in ONF and then worked with a bunch of carriers, and they said, well, we're not ready to join ONF, but we're already members of ETSI, so let's kind of do a similar take on this in an organization that we're already members of. And so NFV is sort of like, as you said, SDN applied to carriers. And early SDN seemed like it was largely sort of cloud-driven and data center-centric. NFV is going to probably be participating in data centers, but it may not always be the traditional data centers we think of. We hear now mini and micro and nano data centers. And so it is, I have trouble actually separating NFV from SDN, except for saying SDN for carriers. I'm sure there is some logical way that you can say, well, this part of NFV is not SDN, but I tend not to think about it that way. I think of both of them as being essentially orchestrated networking, and there probably is SDN that's not NFV, but I have trouble saying, is there some NFV that's not SDN?
Okay, well, my understanding from talking to multiple sources, it seems like most folks that I talk to have come out with the definition of NFV as being separating the software from the hardware, so it's not hardware dependent. So two of our panelists already talked a little bit about SDN. So Mark, why don't you take a moment to comment on what your definition of SDN is?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paula. The classic definition of SDN is really the separation of the control plane and the data plane. But what we've found is when we talk to service providers and carriers, they use the term SDN quite often to really encapsulate the concepts of automation, of orchestration, and of abstraction. And really, so the idea here is that, and open programmability. I guess that's the other big piece. And so, the idea is to really move the telco into the model and bring the benefits of the cloud into the telco environment. Is focused primarily around the areas of automation and the ability to write and deliver new services in internet time instead of telco time, which has classically been sort of 12 to 18-month development cycles.
Chris, what's your view on the definition of SDN?
So I look at SDN as it's about service programmability. I agree. Whereas NFV was really more about moving things to general purpose processing. And one way I like to, and a lot of this is merging, but one way I like to think about it is SDN to me is more about OPEX and NFV is more about capex. So if you do that right in SDN, you save a lot on OPEX in terms of programmability and introduction of new services, shrinking the cycle time, all of that. Do it right on NFV, it's all about capex. The center of the universe for SDN tends to be the data center, whereas in NFV, it tends to be the NOC, because that's, now NOCs are looking a lot more like data centers over time, but that's kind of the center of the universe. The protocol, on SDN, it seems to be a run toward open flow. Whereas if I talk to carriers about NFV, it seems to be more open. They're more open to what are some of the other protocols that might be available. Formalization happens on SDN more with ONF. It happens more with ITSI on NFV. So they're closely related, but they kind of come from two different worlds. Consequently, they have different characteristics.
So they're closely related, so is, Mark, you've said to me in the past, I don't know if this is still your view, that you view NFV as a subset of SDN. I believe that was you. Correct me if I'm wrong. Or, do you need one to realize the full benefits of the other, or what's the relationship? Mark, why don't you start?
Well, so I'm not sure I said that.
Okay.
If I did, that's fine.
I stand corrected.
But NFV is definitely better with SDN. I mean, and so if you go back to the way I described SDN as being focused around automation and orchestration and abstraction and those open programming interfaces, they bring a lot to the NFV functionality. So you could do NFV without SDN. For example, you could buy a firewall software package from a traditional firewall vendor that's now offering a virtual software package for their firewall, and you can plop it down on a single server and just hit go and run and turn it up and have it run. And that's, that you could call that NFV. That's a legitimate use of the term NFV. But if you layer on top of that all the orchestration, the management, and the ability to be dynamic and respond to network conditions, for example, in an automated, dynamic way, it becomes a much more powerful combination.
Okay, Imran, do you want to elaborate a bit on the relationship?
Sure. So we at Cosmos view this more from a holistic point of view. So if we look at SDN and NFV, they have a lot of goals that are in common. One, as my colleagues have alluded to, is to drive standardization across hardware. And in that, in some respects, is going to lead to some degree of commoditization. You're going to see more standard COTS-based servers. So that's going to help, if you're running a NOC, it's going to help with operational as well as capital expenditures. So that's definitely going to optimize their total cost of ownership. The other area that is happening through these different standards, primarily being led by SDN because it's more standards driven as opposed to NFV, which is at this point more carrier-led initiative, is we're seeing more components. I would say the componentization, if that's a word, that are being linked through APIs, whether it's through Open Daylight that aims to create a framework for NFV and for SDN. We talked about ONF. Obviously, you have Etsy. So you have these different initiatives, and I don't think they're working against each other. They're sort of working in the same direction, and that's what's causing standardization to happen on the hardware side. It's causing componentization of the software by having these APIs being linked together. And from a carrier perspective, we're seeing that you're going to require more built-in service awareness. Whether it's through DPI, you're making your applications and services more aware.
Curt, did you want to add anything to the conversation?
Sure, I do think it's interesting. In the early days of SDN, one of the claims was that it was going to lower capex a lot. You don't hear that conversation so much anymore. And when I hear about reducing capex in an NFV kind of context, I think there's also a lot of OpEx reduction that goes along with that. So when you buy a new piece of equipment, you got to go to the place. It's not all in COs these days in central offices, so you have to send a truck out to swap out that base station. So it's partly a capex thing, probably a bit more capex centric than pure, than non-NFV SDN. But it seems like the participants in ONF and many of the participants in NFV Etsy it's just a huge overlap. I do think it's that they're aiming at the same thing. One is more carrier-centric, and as I think of it as carrier-centric SDN. It's not purist SDN in the sense that traditional SDN definition was let's separate the control plane from the data plane. There will be cases in NFV where the control and data pass along the same wire out to the home or the enterprise. And so somebody might point to that and say, see, that's not SDN because the control and the data plane have not been separated. Okay. What do I do with, how does that help? So I tend to see them as subsets, and I don't remember, I think someone else also suggested that.
Chris, did you want to add anything on?
I just, one thing I was thinking of on SDN is I wonder what business model emerges on top of SDN. So we talked about APIs, the APIs and the fact that you would develop applications on that. So 5 years forward on SDN, is it more the Apple model where there are vendors that come out with that platform, that SDN platform, and then there's a community that writes all these applications, and there's some sort of revenue sharing model that sits on, I have this neat little billing application that does these things. I put it on some sort of open daylight type of scenario, and that's the business model? Or no, are the applications going to be delivered by the company that builds that SDN architecture? So I'm not sure which one of those will emerge. I think it might be, I think it might be the former. I think it might be the Apple model where you have that SDN platform, you have the APIs, and the actual applications that whoever that user is taking in could be written by all sorts of different people. There's some sort of clearinghouse, there's some sort of revenue sharing model. I think that's what's going to be interesting about SDN is where do those applications come from and who's writing those?
Well, that's interesting because that reminds me of something I was thinking about when I was thinking about like where the telcos have been and what they've been talking about doing in the last few years in light of the over-the-top threat. So first the mobile telcos were talking about, hey, the iTunes and the Apple App Store are pretty cool. Maybe we'll like have our own mobile app stores. Well, that didn't really pan out. And then I remember before I joined TMC, ADIS hired me to write a story about something called service-oriented networks. In 2009, I believe that was. And again, the idea was about open networks, availing your network resources to others through APIs. And so kind of maybe a different positioning. It was more about opening up network resources to third parties. But again, the same themes of network agility and things like that. And I just wondered how any of that might have contributed to what is now NFV and SDN. And if those things didn't work, what's happening now that will enable NFV and SDN to meet their promise? Anybody?
Well, I think a key driver, and there's been some discussion of this already, is the push toward open. And in both cases, you could say Etsy and ONF are driven more on the customer side than a lot of standards efforts that are more vendor driven. Certainly there is some SDN washing going on where something that's pretty vertical and pretty closed is being called SDN. That feels a bit more like the 2009 or earlier version. With regard to the business model, I think both business models will work. That some folks will say, you know, I'll give you this equipment or this platform at a lower cost, you know, or maybe it's amortized or something. And the catch is that, you know, every time somebody downloads an app, you know, you're going to get a bill from me. And then there's going to be other folks that say, no, I want to write my own apps and I don't want to pay you every time I upgrade my own app. So the more that's, I think, the Web 2.0 folks. Is that NFV or is that SDN? Are they service providers or not? You know, it's kind of getting blurry. Is Amazon a service provider? It certainly seems like they are at some level. So I think one difference is the more open standards. And an open standard that is published but doesn't spell everything out is not good enough for doing interoperable work. So that's open but without really being interoperable.
Did anybody else want to comment?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add one thing is that one of the reasons that this is most likely going to have, you know, long-term significance is, I think, is because there is this momentum, there is this belief that's come on board by so many parties that are involved that this is real, that it's the time is right, and so, you know, all that momentum behind it is going to drive this, I think, across the finish line. And one other point on the business model discussion that you guys were having, which I thought was great, and I think there's a real opportunity there for something like that to happen. But one thing that is definitely going to happen as a result of the openness is, you know, partnerships, ecosystems are developing now. They're happening all over the place. We're involved in, you know, partnerships with a number of people two of you guys are on the stage actually in terms of real engagements with real opportunities, customers, and our customers, the service providers, are driving us to that model. They want to be able to pick the best of the breed for certain components in the system, and what that forces those of us who are building management and orchestration systems and underlying infrastructure hardware is what that does is that forces us to be very open at every layer. And if we're not, then we have to come in with this monolithic story that says, hey, you've got to buy all this from us, and that's just not what they want to hear. And they are definitely driving the industry to much more open, horizontal, not vertical model.
I would echo that. The fact that we're seeing SDN primarily being driven through open standards allows the playing field to be wide open. So it allows for different types of business models and for companies such as ours to be in play. We're a niche provider of deep packet inspection software. So by the very nature of being open, you're allowed to play in the game. I think what's going to happen 5-6 years from now is hard to predict, clearly. SDN, if we look at some of the major drivers, the OTTs that you mentioned, Google, Facebook, clearly there's a market there for small companies to play and then to have unique business models. On the NFV side, we don't believe that these are mutually exclusive initiatives. There is going to be an overlap over time, but frankly speaking, the NFV space is a little bit more, I would say it's more of a hodgepodge, given the fact that you have different hardwares that are in play, different architectures that are in play. It's an entirely different ecosystem. It's not your standard x86 that you typically see in a data center or in a cloud environment. So at some point in time, the two are going to mesh. I think the operators are going to drive this. We're one step removed from the operator, so I can offer you less visibility on what is going to transpire there. But from a network equipment vendor point of view, we definitely understand what the technological needs are going to be for this market.
Chris, did you want to chime in?
Oh, I think I would, and there are probably those here in the room who have sold to telcos, and when a telco describes this open, happy world, and you got to be a little careful, because I think what a telco wants to do may be a lot like what Cable Labs is, where it gets so standardized, and then for a lot of times there's a tug of war with the vendor. I mean, the vendors are trying to say, well, I got to eke out some sort of value in this. So I think there'll be sort of a tug of war between the vendors and the service providers with respect. I mean, open always sounds good, right? And we all say, oh yeah, open, and let's do kumbaya. But you got to be a little bit careful about you're going to have to carve out your value add in a different way. I think the premise of this panel was, is it friend or foe? I think I would call it a fro, because not an afro, but a combination of friend and foe.
We have a fromance, maybe?
Kind of a fromance. There's a lot of ways we can go with this panel. Because I think for the service provider, is it a friend or a foe? It could be a friend, but it's a foe in the terms, and I think Amazon could easily become sort of a service provider without Amazon even making it a strategic initiative. They become a service provider. So it's a foe in the sense that it's so easy for another powerful company to back into, almost inadvertently or very tactically, back into being a very formidable competitor.
They already are.
And they already are, right? You're already there, and I think that they represent that threat. So in that sense, NFV, SDN, it could be a foe. It's a friend in the sense of the power of combining those approaches and dramatically reducing cost on your network and changing your service velocity. So that would be my answer to the premise of the panel.
I have a few more questions, but yeah, go ahead.
As these solutions become virtualized, obviously you can start running them on the same hardware. So my question is, how much effort do you see going into standardizing high-level requirements and test environments as to benchmark performance, test interoperability, things like that?
Yeah, this is an interesting problem that's going on just within SDN, which is arguably narrower, but maybe not. Both of them need to have standardization, and it seems like you pick the wrong standard, you slow things down. It may be better to allow for slightly proprietary sort of extension-based solutions that then get rolled back into the standard over time. One of the things that's true about both of these, SDN and NFV, is they're very much an ecosystem, and it's kind of hard to sell one element without other aspects of the ecosystem there. But then you kind of need some kind of standard or at least partnerships. If you do a full vertical thing, then nobody else gets to play, and it doesn't really build the ecosystem. As such, I think it's a slower process than just introducing a new technology that's pretty narrow and based on like 10 gig, for example, 10 gig Ethernet or whatever.
So, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think as the business matures and as people begin to roll these out, they're going to find some of the holes that you're talking about, that you alluded to, in that, you've brought in multi-tenancy into systems. There's the requirements around, isolation of traffic, isolation of resources, and protection of resources, and all those things are very real. Now, the good news is a lot of that's been solved in the cloud, space, and so because a lot of that's been solved in the cloud space, that can roll into the telco, NFV and SDN space. But it is definitely an area that I believe will need to get some attention as this starts rolling out.
So how many of you were at the last ETSI NFV meeting, which happened a few weeks ago in Santa Clara? It was my first meeting, but Cosmos has been there since the very beginning. And it was, I think, meeting number 4. They have about 6 more meetings, and they're going to sunset by the end of or beginning of 2015. The good thing is the industry, the operators recognize there's a need to drive this, which is what they're doing. Now, when we talk to the operator about, well, what about standards? Are you going to come up with requirements, benchmarking, guidelines? These are identified as gaps. So they're not there to dictate what the standards and what the they're there to provide guidelines on how to do this. But your point is absolutely right. These need to be driven, and they need to be to some degree codified, not to the extent that it's going to stifle discussion and innovation, but clearly, if this is an initiative that wants to continue to evolve, these are things that are going to have to get more crystallized.
Chris, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think you put your finger exactly on something we oftentimes forget, or something that kind of worked in the old way because there was a dominant vendor that might have that. But then when you go to this new world order where you have lots of different ones, the problem is exactly what you said. I wonder if there's going to be, what will emerge out of the mist is some sort of de facto standard that allows, that everybody plays toward. And that might be because there emerges a dominant vendor or something to that effect, sort of like, why do we all communicate through Ethernet, right? It just happens that that's what emerged. And I wonder in the world of SDN, if something like that, if a de facto emerges rather than an ETSI or an open forum dictating a standard, it might be a de facto.
Any other questions? Yes.
On a related note, there are standards and then there are implementation of standards.
Yes.
So while it's nice to think about, what openness brings, the rich multi-vendor scenarios and so on, at some point, somebody has to take all these disparate multi-vendor pieces, especially in the early days, pretty long period of thing, and put it together and make sure everything works. Do you see that, being taken on by the carriers who are going to use it? Or do you see this as an opportunity where there's solution providers that will come up, kind of like, I hate to use the word, but like VARs in the enterprise space, who put together multi-vendor solutions, make sure everything works, not just follow the standard, but actually works together, and validates it somehow? Or do you see that as carriers taking on this new added responsibility of working with different technologies just to get the richness of multi-vendor and the flexibility?
I think what will emerge is the latter of what you described. I think that's a business opportunity, and that I think there will be a business opportunity. There will be companies that will jump into that breach, in my opinion.
Well, what we see out in the real world is service providers are typically selecting an anchor vendor, and then asking the ecosystem partners to work with that anchor vendor to make sure that things are work. And they are performing some integration work themselves, however, because you can't just say, go make it work and have it happen all smoothly. But definitely, typically an anchor, software management system or a function that they've selected as, everybody needs to play nicely with this function, and then driving for the vendors to do a lot of the legwork to demonstrate interoperability and full manageability and that sort of thing.
There definitely are systems integrators that are out there helping to put these systems together, and they're hired by the telcos. In other cases, sort of how much of that system integrator function do they pay for? How much of it do they do themselves? Depends on their resources. To the degree that they can do that themselves, they're not educating the systems integrator as much, and essentially creating more competition for themselves when that system integrator goes to the telco down the street. So it's a mix. I think the telcos with more resources are doing more of the system integrator function. And this, we didn't really mention this, but these telcos, they were doing NFV before there was an NFV program, right?
Great point.
What they've done by getting together is to make it a bit more open, come up with some open specs. They're not really standards, but there's a push to say, look, we all want this. You guys, you vendors should all march in the same direction on this.
I think I agree with the comments here on the panel. What's likely, a scenario that's likely is, given the openness of the standards, you're going to see best of breed software from specialists, whether it's a DPI specialist or whether it's a vendor providing application acceleration or what have you. So you're going to have best of breed technologies, components that are going to be linked through APIs. Someone's going to need to bring it all together and demonstrate these through trials and POCs for carriers. So the opportunity is for, I think, all of us. But you are going to see opportunities, manifest themselves for SIs and in very large, network equipment providers to put this all together. Because someone's going to have to put this together and spend hundreds of, millions of dollars in validating these for carriers.
It looks like we have time for one more question. Is there one question? Okay, in that case, I'd like to just go down the line and ask each of our panelists if there's just one message that you wanted to convey to the audience today, one message about what they need to know about NFV and or SDN. What is that one thing? Curt?
I would say that it probably isn't that helpful to tweeze out exactly the separation between SDN and NFV. A lot of the same vendors in the same space, and just make sure that you are getting the functionality that you need or delivering the functionality that your customer needs.
Mark?
Strap on your seatbelt. It's going to be a wild ride.
You sound like Ted Turner.
I would say these are, pure software plays. Huge opportunity.
Yeah, I would agree with the panelists. I agree. I wouldn't fret about trying to distinguish between one or the other. The most power is when they're together, and when they are together, it really changes the game. And by a change in an industry, that brings up all kinds of threats and opportunities, and you just want to make sure you're on the opportunity side of those changes.
Thanks. And just to explain the Ted Turner reference, he used to always be the keynote speaker at the Western Cable Show, and he used to start every speech by saying, fasten your seatbelts. So thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to the audience. I believe we have a 10-minute break now. Feel free during the breaks to visit the booths across the hall. If you need direction, the folks at the registration desk can help you. And I believe that there are also speaker evaluation forms on the tables. If you don't have one, somebody in the back of the room or at the registration desk can find you one. Thanks again. and coffee.